Right, now we have a talk from somebody who, to my surprise, I don't think, Kay, you and I have met before, which is a bit of a surprise. Kay Harrison is New Zealand's climate change ambassador. She represents New Zealand at international meetings, summits and negotiations, and she leads the New Zealand delegation to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and on the Paris Agreement rulebook. She's attended Victoria University in Wellington, where she gained a Master of Arts in History. So that's good qualification here. But also a Master of Public Policy, and above all, she's a Harkness Fellow at Harvard University at the Kennedy School of Government. So I think that fits her very well as our climate change ambassador. Kay, over to you.
Tēnā koutou katoa, ngā mihi nui kia koutou I roto I ngā āhuatanga pauri I roto I ngā āhuatanga ua o tēnei wā. Greetings everyone. I would like to start by echoing Minister Shaw's remarks in acknowledgement of the loss of people in Auckland, Northland, Coromandel, Tairāwhiti and the Hawke's Bay. That loss and that damage cannot be understated and must be in all of our hearts today as we grapple with these complex issues. I have a button. I'm going to go for the big green one. Perhaps the title of this talk, International Climate Change Targets and Actions, could have been, so what are we in the world are we doing about this, following, as I am, Andy's presentation of the science. And he ended by saying, we know what to do, we know how to do it, let's just do it. Well, there's just one thing that gets in the way, and it's people. So climate change, as you know, is a global problem. It's a super wicked problem. Social scientists Levin, Kashaw, Auld and Bernstein introduced this concept in 2007. Wicked problems have about 14 characteristics. My favourite is number 13, great resistance to change. When it comes to super wicked problems, they have 4 more characteristics. There is no or weak central authority dedicated to finding a solution. Those seeking to solve the problem are also causing it. We human beings, this is the third one, we human beings irrationally won't do now what we need to do for the future. Instead, we push our responses into the future when they will cost more and be less effective. And the fourth characteristic of a super wicked problem is time is always running out. So I'm here to talk about the global response, and you won't be surprised that it conforms to the description of a super wicked problem: weak, irrational, and late. So part 1, what are the international targets? Well, I've come out and told you I've got a history degree. I was also a history teacher, and so I can't help myself. I'm going to give you a short history lesson. Our first global attempt to deal with climate change was the agreement of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, a treaty signed in 1992, before most of my team at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs were born. Its operational arm, the Kyoto Protocol, ran from 2008 to 2020. The objective was to reduce global emissions, and it achieved that. Developed countries had targets, and they were met, including New Zealand's. There was one exception, Canada, who left the Kyoto Protocol rather than fail and be penalised for not meeting its target. There's an important lesson in that. KP Flaw 1. If you make a treaty that's binding and has teeth, countries will leave if they're about to fail, or they won't take the risk of joining in the first place. But that Kyoto Protocol effort was in a world in which we thought we only needed to reduce emissions. People thought that if we mitigated enough, if we reduced enough, we wouldn't actually even have to adapt. We thought we only needed to reduce emissions, not entirely change our economies and reverse the harm we were doing to natural systems. Flaw 2 in the Kyoto model was that only developed countries were required to reduce emissions because they had historical responsibility for this whole mess in the first place. Flaw 3, of course, was that the US decided not to join. The biggest emitter in that group. Emissions in the developing world were and are now mushrooming. Developed country emissions, especially if you take out the US, are a small minority now. In 2011, it was beginning to dawn on people that reducing emissions wasn't going to be enough, and getting only the developed world to do it was also not going to be enough to keep us from the dangerous world we are now experiencing. And we realised that our mitigation efforts had not been enough to stop us from having to adapt. We started in 2011 to talk about transitioning our economies to a low emissions future. And so in Durban at COP17, we agreed to build a treaty applicable to all. That treaty was concluded in 2015, the Paris Agreement. We'd learned some important lessons from Kyoto, and we built in a system of ratchets. Every time you put in a target, it had to be greater than your last one. Transparent reporting and accountability rather than punitive compliance regimes that people would just run out of the treaty if they had to face. And a global stocktake at regular intervals so we could adjust and improve our response. Sounds better. But once again, the science overtook us. Andy and his hard-working fellows, in 2018, the IPCC produced a special report on limiting warming to an average of 1.5 degrees. And this was pressed for, in large part, by our neighbours in the Pacific, because they kept saying, we're the canary in the coal mine. We are experiencing things before you and harder than you. Paris had called for a limiting of global average temperature to rise to 2 degrees or striving for 1.5. So this report on 1.5 was a real wake-up after Paris. What countries had put forward, and it's still the case today as Andy showed you, what countries had put forward as their targets out to 2030 was not going to keep us to below 1.5. Not only that, mitigation had let us down, not enough mitigation. Adaptation was happening, but not enough adaptation. And in some cases, it was going to be too late. It is too late to adapt. The Maldives, for example, no longer have any fresh water. True too for parts of the Pacific. Countries were called upon to revise their targets, their NDCs, before the Glasgow COP of 2021. That COP delivered the historic Glasgow Climate Pact. Paris was supplemented by the agreement of all countries with, amongst other things, pledges to phase down unabated coal-fired power generation and phase out fossil fuel subsidies. A work program was established for an urgent scale-up of action between now and 2030, this critical decade. And there were also calls and agreement to double adaptation finance. We need to continue to respond to the science, and science is now telling us unequivocally the world's emissions must peak by 2025, and we must about halve global emissions by 2030, and we must phase out all fossil fuels. New Zealand will push for these objectives at the next COP and every COP until we get back on track. And we need to recognise that there needs to be finance not just for mitigation and adaptation, but also loss and damage. The loss and damage that vulnerable countries in the Pacific, for example, have been experiencing for years, and we in New Zealand are now intimately aware of. So, action. We've had the targets, what's the action been? Well, we know, as Andy said, exactly what we need to do, and many countries are doing it. First of all, you need to get your house in order. You need domestic legislation and architecture. An independent and expert commission, Rod, is a good idea. Domestic emissions budgets, plans to reduce in line with your budgets, and critically accountability. You'll hear more from the Commission on this, I'm sure. First and foremost, climate change has always been about a clean energy revolution. Fossil fuels are number one on any climateer's hit list. Prices for renewables are competitive, true, but the costs of decommissioning coal-fired power plants and investing in new boilers are high. In the past 2 years, the G7 countries have announced significant packages of support and concessional loans to the biggest G20 developing country emitters, joint energy transition partnerships, which could turn energy emissions around in South Africa, Indonesia, and Vietnam. New Zealand can contribute to that either with climate finance aid or through carbon markets, supplementing our own more expensive transition efforts in an attempt to get the volume of reductions we've committed to under Paris without shutting down our economy or killing all our cows. What I allude to here, of course, is that New Zealand is not like most of the world. You know, we are special. Yes, we need to join the clean energy revolution. Offshore wind could be a big opportunity for us. We also need to deal with transport, industrial heat, and the waste sector. And we have other challenges that it is our mission, I believe, to solve: agriculture, nature, and biodiversity. That is why it is my great pleasure to be with you at this conference, to learn from you, and to take your messages of innovation and hope out into the world. The rest of the world is looking to us. Once they've addressed emissions from energy, their emissions profiles will look a lot more like ours, high in agriculture emissions. In New Zealand right now, we are grappling with the grief and the loss and the damage caused by severe weather. Naturally, our immediate attention is on recovery and from then building greater resilience. But we must redouble our commitment to mitigation, to reducing emissions here and abroad. I make no apology for focusing my remarks on mitigation. We must transition our and every economy. It is rational and always less costly and less truly harmful than the alternative. We will face worse, more Gabriels from the north and Antarctic storms from the south. We are vulnerable, not by any means as vulnerable as our neighbours, and we have a duty to the vulnerable. In some, we will need to provide more aid, contribute more to reducing emissions, build for resilience, and recover after every nightmarish month like the one we have just had. As Minister Shaw said, quoting Churchill, we are in the period of consequences. But we are also still in a period of possibilities and opportunities. It is not too late. Your innovation and courage will be of tremendous value in our world. Once again, may I say how much I'm looking forward to hearing from you all, and I wish you all the very best for a conference that buoys us with hope. Tēnei taku mihi atu kia koutou, he waka eke noa. He waka eke noa had a life before the government agriculture sector initiative on pricing agriculture emissions, you know. It's a beautiful whakatauki. And it means, of course, that we are all in one fragile canoe together on the vast and stormy Pacific Ocean, on the big blue marble. The fact is, though, we are not all in one boat. The vessels of some of our Pacific neighbours are very flimsy. We are, however, all in the same storm. Nō reira, kia kaha, kia maia, kia manawa nui, kia ora.
Kia ora, Kate. I hope you've got a few minutes to stay with us. Thank you. Your early remarks reminded me that I'm accidentally wearing a Canadian pin in my lapel. So from now on, I shall take to calling it a rather nice maple leaf with no political implications. Right, we do have one down the front, and let's start there. Yes.
Thank you for a great talk. One of the things that we keep hearing about in the agricultural sector is carbon leakage. How do you suggest we deal with carbon leakage in an agricultural context?
Thank you. Very good question. Carbon leakage is always a problem when you have a patchwork of responses globally to emissions pricing in particular. And we have pretty long history in managing carbon leakage around other areas of greenhouse gases that are priced, and we should probably look to those for agriculture as well. I guess there needs to be research, there need to be measures, but what we do as well in my office is we press for a number of things. We press for countries around the world to address mitigation in agriculture, just as we do, so that levels the playing field somewhat. We also press for the elimination of harmful subsidies, which is something we do both in fossil fuels but also in agriculture, because in the agriculture sector you're competing with countries who largely subsidise agriculture. So those are two things that you can kind of work on to get a better even playing field, but it's something we have to definitely keep an eye on, because there's no value in the climate sense if there's leakage. So good point.
How are we doing? One in the middle over here.
Kia ora, thank you. Internationally, NDCs are in carbon dioxide equivalents, but domestically we have a split gas target. Do you think it would be better if internationally gases or targets were also split out by gases to provide greater clarity?
Really, NDCs around the world are in all sorts of shapes and forms. Some developing countries have sectoral targets, some have quite policy-specific targets. It is literally a nationally determined contribution. But the thing that the atmosphere needs most of all is a good sense of what the volume of reductions a country is going to contribute to the whole. And so I don't know if there's actually greater clarity or less clarity if you split gases and NDCs. What we press for where we can is for countries like China, for example, to have an all sectors, all gases target. The simple metric is to express it in CO2e. Our problems are bigger than whether or not that's clear. Our problems are that some countries leave out whole sectors and whole gases altogether. And we have agreed in the Paris Agreement that we will all work towards all sector, all gases targets. We have agreed to express them in CO2e, and we have agreed to take the lead as developed countries. Thanks.
Okay, and John at the back there.
Thank you, Steve. Kay, can I just go back to your comment around subsidies? I had a meeting earlier this morning with the representatives of the global dairy industry in a short call, and we were talking about mitigation interventions, the things that make a difference in terms of intensity of carbon emissions. And what they're observing, and a report that's recently come out from the World Bank and the International Food Policy Research Institute, is that subsidies make a huge difference in those countries to farmers who need to adopt those technologies, as opposed to relying on a marketplace to deliver it. Do you have a view in MFAT on subsidies that are purely production lifting versus those that are there to also create environmental benefits? Do you discern between the two in your campaigning? Thank you.
Absolutely. What you're talking about here is the way a government can use a carrot or it can use a stick. And in our country, we've been very good at crafting sticks for many, many decades. But we also know that that subsidies are consumption subsidies are very, very harmful. Production subsidies sometimes can be of value. I don't think you can be puritanical about it, but I think what we are focused on at MFAT, and particularly in the trade side, is harmful subsidies, consumption subsidies. We know that an enormous, in fact, I can't remember the numbers, but enormous numbers of emissions can be sheeted home to harmful subsidies in agriculture, as well as in oil and gas. So you have to be subtle, you have to be clever, but subsidies, generally speaking, not a good idea.
Thank you. Kay, we're running a little bit behind time. That's my fault, not yours. So I'd just like to thank you. We were all reminded by Andy that even if nations meet their current commitments under current agreements, we're not going to make it. We ain't going to get there in time. So your work on behalf of New Zealand becomes increasingly imperative to increase the amount of agreement we get, and of course the actions that take place in the country. So thank you very much for joining us this morning. Thank you. That leaves us with just a lightning 23 minutes for tea and coffee up in the Oceana room. So if you'd like to gallop your way up there, there are posters up there which you could watch all the time. We'll see you back here at 10:50.